Was there a conspiracy to ban books from the Bible? Did the Gospels forbidden by the early church contain secrets that undermine Christianity? And who chose what Christians should accept as the authoritative truth about Jesus? Well, check this out. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have had their beliefs shaped and nourished by a collection of 27 books called the New Testament. Among these are the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, 13 of Paul's letters, the anonymous Hebrews, the general epistles, 7 of them, and John's Revelation. These are what Christians call the canonical books, from the Greek word canon, meaning they measure up to being divinely inspired scripture. But who exactly voted on which books make the cut? Because in the last 2 centuries, archaeologists have unearthed from the dry sands of the Middle East many more so-called Gospels, especially in the 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi collection in Egypt. These are the famous forbidden Gospels that everyone talks about in conspiratorial terms. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, ancient texts with a very different take on the whole message of Jesus. So how do we know that the early church got the New Testament right? Well, let me say just 3 things. First, contrary to popular conspiracy theories, no central power decided on the canon. As it turns out, political power had little to no role in deciding which books make up the New Testament. No, even with the church as a cultural minority, facing political persecution from the outside and heretical schisms within, the canon emerged somewhat organically. Given the Old Covenant between God and Israel had accompanying scriptures, Aussie scholar Donald Robinson, he observes that the early church expected a New Testament to follow, and so were patient to discern together which apostolic books were used by God to nurture Christian worship and doctrinal orthodoxy. Dating right back to the Apostolic Fathers, the next generation of church leaders after the apostles, people like Papias and Ignatius and Clement of Rome, certain books began to be quoted and revered as though carrying divine authority. Over the next century, different lists of authoritative scripture began to emerge, like the Muratorian fragment circa 175 AD, or by Irenaeus or Clement of Alexandria, even Tertullian. By the time the church historian Eusebius wrote his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, the Christians divided contenders into 3 categories. The Homo Legumina, or accepted books, were unanimously including the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's epistles, and Revelation, with 1 Peter and 1 John mostly passing. Then there were the anti-legomena, or the disputed books, ones like Hebrews, the rest of the general epistles, and other books like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Didache. Some of these later ones you'll even find in our earliest New Testament collections, like the Codex Sinaiticus. And then there were the pseudepigrapha, or the false writings, which is where the forbidden Gospels are always listed. So when did the church finish that discernment process and finally arrive on the 27 books that now make the cut? Well, whilst most scholars point to the Easter letter of Athanasius in 367 AD as the first complete canonical list, Michael Kruger, I think, rightly argues that Origen, in his homilies on Joshua, recites that same list of 27 books as inspired scripture, or as he calls it, heavenly trumpets, pushing Athanasius' list back almost a century earlier to 250 AD. So please, for the love of all that is history, forget conspiracy theories about Emperor Constantine and the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. They had nothing to do with gerrymandering the canon to suit political agendas. And the later councils of Rome and Carthage at the end of the 4th century AD, or even the Synod of Hippo around the same time, those only continued to stamp an official seal on the same New Testament that had organically and democratically been discerned by the church over these early centuries. Which leads to second, Christians use legitimate criteria to discern scripture. Weighing which books belonged in the accepted, disputed, or forbidden categories depended upon how they measured up to the features that the early church expected for the New Testament scriptures to bear. Chief amongst these was that the canonical books had to be apostolic, meaning they were either penned by an apostle directly, perhaps through an amanuensis, or penned by someone close to an apostle who was trusted to have accurately captured the teaching of the apostles. And that's why the accepted books were so universally received, because they were believed to carry direct apostolic authority. And also why other books were disputed or forbidden, because they either lacked any legitimate apostolic claim or their apostolic credentials were not universally accepted by all Christians. Now, we do know that not all apostolic writings survive in the New Testament. Luke's Gospel tells us that there were many other accounts of Jesus' life that predate his own, of which only Matthew and Mark survive. And Paul likely wrote 4 letters to the church at Corinth, only 2 of which we have, along with a letter to the Laodicean church mentioned in Colossians 4:16 that we don't have anymore. Why? Because apostolic authority was not the only criteria. Sometimes the apostles' correspondence may have only had private or local application. Or given the process of copying a gospel or epistle was incredibly costly, copies were only made of those books that the early Christians considered valuable for the shaping and nurturing of the doctrine and liturgy of the church at large. Which is why some of the books in our New Testament now were originally disputed. Not just because they were formerly anonymous, like Hebrews, but because not all Christians agreed they served to nurture Christian orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So some mixture of being apostolic, universally received or little c Catholic as edifying for teaching and worship, and orthodox in their teaching, those were the major criteria used to see whether New Testament books measured up to Scripture. Which is why, despite being trusted by the early church and useful for us to read now, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, Clement's letter to Corinth, and the Didache just didn't make the cut, and why other books were rejected as spurious altogether. Which leads to third, the Gnostic Gospels were forbidden for good reason. So before believing the wild claims of conspiracy theories online that some powerful church supposedly silenced the truth of competing voices about Jesus, please go and just read these forbidden Gospels for yourself. Why? Well, because in addition to being pseudonymous, where they steal the apostles' names to try and ride the coattails of apostolic credibility, and beyond the fact that they were written in the wrong century, tracing to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries AD, these stories are just wildly unorthodox. Take the Gospel of Thomas. This isn't even a gospel in the same vein as the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is no biography, no fleshy details of real human stories. No, it's a sayings gospel or a collection of 114 teachings of Jesus, like tweets from a rabbi. Now, 2/3 of these sayings are either quotes or paraphrases of stuff that Jesus did really say, entirely consistent with the other New Testament Gospels. But the other 1/3 is totally wild, imagining Jesus to teach a kind of anti-Jewish Gnostic philosophy, where matter is evil, human spirits are imprisoned within it, and where the only way to salvation is by secret knowledge, completely supplanting Christ's cross and empty tomb. And as the cherry on the Gnostic conspiracy cake, guess what? According to the Gospel of Thomas, tweet 114, the last words of Jesus say that only men can be saved. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. So please just read these forbidden Gospels for yourselves. The Gospel of Peter, which denies Jesus' true humanity by saying he felt no pain while being crucified, and which records that the Roman soldiers saw a giant talking cross follow Jesus out of his tomb. The Gospel of Mary, where Jesus secretly taught Mary Magdalene all this weird stuff about dimensions and souls and levels of power, which even the apostles in the story refused to believe. The Gospel of Philip, which is packed with strange teachings about hidden meanings of names and deceptions, and say that Jesus made out with Mary Magdalene. Or even the infancy Gospel of Thomas, where as a boy from 5 to 12, Jesus curses and kills his teachers and playmates just as often as he heals people. Does any of that sound remotely like the historical Jesus? These forbidden Gospels are so wildly unorthodox, obviously born of their own Gnostic philosophies and heresies, such that where they do include fleshy details about the life and times of Jesus, they get them all wrong. And more alarmingly, where these forbidden Gospels depart from the canonical Gospels, they put false Gnostic teaching onto Jesus' lips that run counter to his own Judaism and the whole counsel of Scripture. So check it out for yourself. Truth invites questioning. And when you research the formation of the canon and why Christians organically landed upon the 27 books that make up the New Testament, you can see how they capture the authoritative truth about Jesus of Nazareth that was taught by the apostolic community right back in the 1st century AD. As John states in his Gospel, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing have life in his name. And by stepping into the New Testament and the story that it tells, adopting it as a spiritual curriculum for your own life, maybe like me, you might just experience precisely why God has preserved these inspired books. Because they have a unique power to teach, rebuke, correct, and train Christians to become who we are destined to be forever in God's future world.
G'day, it's Dan here from Questioning Christianity. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, why don't you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube that you can go ahead and follow us on socials.